There's a dead girl in Wily Creek, and has been for over 80 years. The same dead girl, that is, older siblings, parents, and grandparents before them, all claim to have seen her in precisely the same condition she's in today, without any notable sign of decomposition. She appears freshly dead, although by what means she passed is unclear from the body, being that there are no visible injuries on display. The going theory is that she slipped and hit the back of her head on a rock in some way that struck the life out of her without shattering the bone, though none of us can say for sure. Her hair is red, though on the browner side of the spectrum. Her eyes hazel, leaning more to green. She's always glimpsed in a dirty white dress, worn ragged at the hem. Just one boot, the other pale bare foot trailing in the water. And always, whenever you see her, she's lying on her back, staring up past the overhang of trees at the sky. The local police know of the body, who we all call Old Wily, on account of her age, though she only looks 19 at the most. Over the decades, cops and rescue teams have been sent out to her so many times that if they get a call about a cadaver fitting her description in the area, they no longer post out a vehicle. By the time they pull up and get their people splashing all over the creek, there's no sign of the girl, even if someone's been watching her the whole time. She disappears that fast, blinking out in the flicker of an eye. You'd think you'd made her up somehow, if so many others around hadn't seen the same thing. Yet she always comes back, sprawled out in the same spot like she'd never left. What she is, I can't guess at. There's no words, nor manner of creature I've heard of, that fits. Not a soul here knows her real name, or remembers her from when she was alive. She was a drifter, the townspeople reckon, having wandered, homeless, out into the woods, hoping to sleep rough somewhere nobody would bother her. Then, in whatever way she had, she died out there, and hadn't left since. No matter what spells or prayers or exorcism folks attempted over the years to send her away. Picking her up and carrying her out does no good either. As I said, if you try anything of that nature, you only get so far before she vanishes right out of your arms, or off of a stretcher. It drives folks crazy, that I'll tell you. She was harmless enough though, lying there as she did. But she scared people. Children played in those woods. It wasn't right. Then, when I was a boy, a rumor sprung up about old Wily that ended with people thinking she wasn't so harmless after all, which is only a surprise in that it wasn't realized before. For some reason, a bunch of teenagers had gotten it into their heads that the dead girl had powers of some nature. That, like a monkey paw or some other paranormal artifact, you could ask something of her, and she'd give it up to you, just as long as you did her a favor. That favor, as the rumor went, was killing her again. Mind you, plenty of people had tried it over the years, thinking she was some kind of vampire or demon you could stake or burn to set free, and it had never worked. Sure, she'd bleed from a puncture wound, or she'd go up in flames till all was left of her was wet ash. But the next day, she'd be just as she was, square on her back in the creek. But nobody had attempted to drown her, and that was what those young people started doing with old Wily, having the idea somehow that this was what she wanted, that she'd pay them back for their kindness. Where they got the notion is anyone's guess. Someone had heard it from somebody else. Old Wily had whispered it in Luke Singer's brother's ear to do it, I even heard said. All talk, I'm sure, the way kids will. But as it happens, my older cousin Franklin was the first to try the ritual one afternoon, surrounded by a gang of friends all playing hooky, so they could see the dead girl ducked like a witch in the water. I'll confess now that I was there too, though too young by far to see the things I did. As we all stood around talking amongst ourselves, Franklin took old Wily under the arms and dragged her deeper into the creek, holding her head down for a time until he thought it long enough. Being that she was already dead, it wasn't easy to say when she'd be done, or if she'd be satisfied. But after 2 minutes had gone by, he hauled her out back to her usual spot, and knelt down to whisper in her ear whatever it was he wanted in return. Money, I guess. A new car, maybe, since he totaled the old one, and my uncle had sworn up and down he'd never buy him so much as a tricycle again. Something stupid and shallow, anyway. Hardly worth what he did to gain it. Nothing a dead girl could give him, no matter what she was. It was as Franklin was scrambling up from the rocks that he paused and lowered his head again, almost like he was listening to something. None of us others heard a single word, though later some of the kids could have sworn they'd seen the dead girl's lips move, even if they'd been standing too far from that spot to say whether they truly had or not. Next thing you know, Franklin was rocking on his heels, looking like a sick animal. That's the only way I can think of to describe it, with the way his eyes stared around, not knowing any of us, and some sort of grin on his face that in hindsight, I don't reckon was a smile at all. "Frankie?" I said, all nerves. "What's up?" "Nothing," he said, and when he laughed we all stumbled back across the rocks in surprise at how loud he was. "Nothing. She's gonna give me what I wanted. That's all." Just like that, the mood changed, and we all clapped each other on the back and started whooping and carrying on the way teenagers do. A couple of the other kids played out the ritual over the next few days, though I wasn't there on those occasions to bear witness, nor did I notice how they were afterwards. Word travels fast in a small town, is all. Franklin seemed on such a high that all of us assumed whatever it was he'd requested was either here or on its way. He joked and threw basement parties, passed around the booze he'd lifted from his father as though it cost him nothing to get it, though I heard all about the hell he caught afterwards from Uncle Jim. To us kids, this was the celebration of a winner, someone who'd done something daring and came out of it the better. But had I known what I do now, I would have looked at Franklin a little closer, asked him the questions I raised too late to do much good. Young as I was, I only realized that there was something badly wrong with him 2 weeks after the ritual with old Wily. Franklin was sitting in a lawn chair in his backyard that night, looking out into the trees that ran down into the woods around the creek. He'd lost more weight than should have been possible in such a short time, his face as tight around his skull as the skin of a balloon. His eyes had that animal look I'd seen at the creek. Feral and desperate. It scared me like hell. As I reached out to nudge Franklin's arm, he jumped out of his seat away from me, brushing his sleeve off the touch, as though I had dirt on my hands. "What's going on with you?" I asked. "You've been acting crazy since that stuff with old Wily." "Who's crazy?" He snapped back at me. "You don't know shit." But he said it with a liar's guilt, his gaze a mile from mine. "Frankie," I said, "I'm serious. Did she really say something to you?" He shook his head, but again he was telling a lie. The skin on my neck crawled up and down with a sort of dread, and as I opened my mouth to fire out another question, he finally spoke. "That thing I asked for. It's coming tomorrow." He smiled with all his teeth, but the rest of him was wired with hysteria, his feet tapping, his hands flexing around the open air. I stared at him, unsure of what to make of his behavior. "She said that's when it would happen." Franklin's head bobbed wildly on his neck, and I moved away from him towards the house, unnerved. I didn't repeat what he told me to anyone. The ritual was a secret to be kept from the adults that would ban us from the creek the second they got wind of it. And besides, I couldn't prove that it meant anything, least of all, something bad. When the following morning rolled around, Uncle Jim came knocking on the door of my house, asking if Franklin was there. He'd gone missing in the night, he said, having snuck out of the back door after Uncle Jim and Aunt Sarah were asleep. Being that Franklin never did anything crazy without inviting me along with him, I knew bad news was on its way. I just didn't know where from, or how. It was later that afternoon that word reached us that there was some commotion down at Wily Creek. We saw 6 or 7 cars heading out there, one of which idled outside the house as my father approached, the driver's face white and oily over the rolled-down window. "Ought to get yourself out there, Stan," he said. "They're saying your nephew's in a bad way, and he ain't the only one neither." "How bad?" my father asked in alarm, but the driver wouldn't say, taking off before he could wring another word out of him. I insisted on joining my father as he cut through the woods, trailing close behind him with a sense of fear on me like a sweating sickness. A crowd of people, old and young, were milling around the creek, oddly silent for such a collected number. I briefly saw my aunt and uncle clinging to each other, before my father grabbed me by the shoulders, wrenching me in the other direction. "You don't need to see this," he told me. "Get out of here." But I was a strong kid for my age, and so I got myself out from under his arm and looked down at the creek, even as my dad cursed and objected in my ear. Where usually there was just one body floating in the creek, there were now many. All of them people I knew. All of them those who'd taken part in the ritual. My cousin was among them, bobbing lazily between the stones, his dead eyes no longer animal-like in their emptiness. The dead girl that had started it all lay at the heart of the water, and I could swear her pale mouth looked damned near like it was smiling at what she'd done. The corpses were taken away, all of them allowed to leave the creek but she, avoidant, as always, of being moved in any way she didn't ask for. In absence of knowing what else to do, town officials fenced off the area and put up signs warning people to not trespass, which, truthfully, had little effect. Kids will be kids, and looky-loos of all types still make their way down to gawp at old Wily whenever they fancied it. What she said to all those youths I'll never know. Not one of the dead had ever spoken of it to anyone, I'm told, nor detailed what it was they wanted out of her. Some think the girl told them to drown themselves out of spite, that they walked down into the water helpless against the terror of knowing the end before them. She was an old, old woman, after all. Maybe not even a woman at all, but something that only looked like one to all of us. Something knotted up in the husk of itself, hating us all. Others say that the kind of things those kids wanted were the sort they'd only ever get through dying, that it was death itself they truly asked for and the thrill they sought from her. But I don't hold with either theory, though I can't say why I'm so set against them both. The longer I think on it, the more certain I am that, for the first time since she died, old Wily sat up and pushed each one of those young people down under the water with her own hands. But I'll never be sure. And I'll never get close enough to the dead girl to ask her